Hello, everyone. This is Father Paul, and I hope you're having a good day. You're listening to Copts in Conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Copts in Conversation, where today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Michael Ecladius. Dr. Michael is a lecturer in historical studies at the University of Toronto and a social sciences instructor at Philopatia Christian College. He founded and directs Egyptian Migrations, a Canadian nonprofit focused on community outreach, archival preservation, and education. Through Egypt Migrations, Michael mentors young Egyptian professionals and has preserved extensive records of Coptic history in North America. He's finalizing his SSHRC-funded research on 20th century Egyptian migration with a book forthcoming titled Ordinary Copts, Ecumenism, Activism, and Belonging in North American Cities. Visit www.michaelacladius.com to learn more and follow Egyptian Migrations on Instagram and Twitter. So, welcome, Dr. Ecladius.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be with you.
It's great to see you again and to speak with you again. And it's always a pleasure. I'm always learning from you. And your work is very exciting. And it's exciting for a lot of reasons. For some of them are personal because I'm the child of an immigrant and I came as an immigrant. And it's always helpful to understand my place in society, but it's also helpful because of I'm a priest and I serve in a church where there's a large immigrant population. And it's always important to understand these dynamics and how things work and where are we heading and the trends that are happening and the things and the forces that kind of move us and shape our thinking and our interactions with the society that we're in. So before we get into it, why history? What got you into history? Were there any indications as a young child, when children are playing, with cubes and Legos and stuff? Were you playing, with encyclopedias, history books? Did your parents have any idea that you're going to turn out to be a historian?
There's many stories of how I ended up here. I suppose the brief of it is that I did not like the maths and sciences. I could not. I was barely passing. I was always, forgive me, God, I was always cheating off of my peers and trying to get through, just survive, the mandatory maths and sciences in high school. And
it's confession time.
Exactly. And I was much more interested in history, geography, literature, English, just that's where my passion was. And a lot of why this topic in particular has to do with the fact that I am also the child of immigrants. I am an immigrant myself. Technically, I came when I was 8, so I'm generation 1.5. And that generation is always the one that's kind of lost in the middle, right? Doesn't know who they are, doesn't know where they belong, and is always at home nowhere really, because I know even till today whenever I'm in Egypt I feel Canadian, whenever I'm in Canada I feel Egyptian. And so there is always that internal battle of like, where do I belong? And it's something that really motivated me and still does to this day to understand what is the Coptic immigrant experience. I mean, ultimately the core of all of my research, the book that's coming out, the work that I do, anything that I publish, it's at its core, the single question is, what is the Coptic immigrant experience? How do we find belonging? What is our role in relation to our church community, in relation to the outside world and secular society? How do we navigate all of these different spaces and the geopolitics of the Middle East and the political tensions across Canada and the United States, even till today. So it's all about understanding that. And then in terms of why this topic, it also comes back to my grandfather. Farag Ecladius, he had a contracting firm in Alexandria with his brother Sharobim, and they built all of the churches in Alexandria aside from St. Mark's, the first church, the cathedral. And so they were heavily involved, very close with Pope Kyrillos. They built the St. Mina Monastery for him. And so my family sort of has that legacy that sort of
Right.
I carried, and I just constantly felt like I had these towering giants in my life, in my
Mm-hmm.
family. And so the more that I began to kind of question who I am and to learn about my roots, and I remember my undergrad fourth year paper, I sat with Father
Mm-hmm.
Marcos in Toronto,
Yeah. Blessed memory. Yeah.
and he was still serving in the church at the time. And so we sat. He showed me like all these files that he had locked away in a cabinet somewhere, and we went through that. And I was just really curious about like the church in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
That turned into a master's on how did we end up with a church presence in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
which turned into a PhD on how Copts and other Egyptians here thinking about minorities like the Armenians, the Greek, the Italian, the
Right.
Jewish, how did they end up across North American cities,
Mm-hmm.
and what position really were the Copts in Egypt and then in these immigrant receiving societies. And that became the heart of my dissertation, which is the book I'm finalizing, to think about, okay, Copts got out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Why did they leave? What instigated it? What kept the flow going? Who are they here? And
Mm-hmm.
what are they trying to make of themselves in immigrant lands? And then ultimately, how do they relate to compatriots at home? So, what is the relationship between Copts in Egypt and Copts in North America? And how do they view each other? And where are we going into the future?
Very good. This is very interesting, and definitely, it's a lot of work. And um, with your history, with your background, family history, how did you find out about your grandfather? I mean, was he alive? Was he able to tell you these stories himself, or did he pass away before you were
Yeah,
able
and
to get that experience from him?
so yeah, unfortunately, I have very few memories of him because
Mm.
he passed when I was 6.
Okay.
And so I still remember, being a little kid hiding under the kitchen table during the Ilaza.
Yeah.
Um, so I didn't have that direct experience of getting stories from him, but of course, in the family, it's everywhere. And he did write a memoir.
He did.
Yeah, a
Mm.
couple of years before he passed,
Mm.
because my father is one of 6, and so we have a very big family. And so he was always getting questions about like, what did you build? What happened? Can you tell us the story again? And so on. So he sat down and he wrote a memoir of like
Mm.
him and his brother's accomplishments. And he was always the dutiful younger brother, so he'd always put his Sharubim's name first,
Of course.
right? And I'm from Upper Egypt, from Asyut, so like very proper gentleman, and always wore suits. And I remember
Mm.
that he used to wear a tarbouche.
Yeah.
But then in the 1960s or so, because I see like pictures of him, and I'm a historian, so I
Mm-hmm.
love patterns and I love like trying to analyze things.
Mm-hmm.
And so around the late 50s, early 60s, he switches out the tarbouche for a French beret. And then he wore the French beret, and that's one of my earliest memories of him when I was a little kid. Is that like he'd always be wearing the French beret.
So you never saw him in the tarbouche except in
No,
pictures.
except in pictures,
Yeah.
yeah. But a tarbouche and a suit.
A tarbouche and a suit, yes.
Yeah, and so it speaks, I think, to that kind of Effendeya
Mm-hmm.
class, right? It speaks to that middle class in Egypt around the colonial, post-colonial period, so late 1930s into the 1950s, 60s, of representing that more kind of Egyptian traditional man, along with that westernized, educated, elite status that comes with a professional standing, that comes with a certain access to money, with some landed status,
Mm-hmm.
So he really embodies that, and a lot of his generation embody that. Those Coptic professionals that helped to expand Alexandria, for instance. I
Right.
mean, when he immigrated to Alexandria, it wasn't much. It was 1921, I believe. He arrives in Alexandria. His brother had arrived in 1919 to kind of set the way for him. And it's small. It's maybe a quarter of the size of what it is today. The population is a tenth of what it is today.
Most of Alexandria are immigrants.
Exactly. Many of them are coming from Upper Egypt into Alexandria. And it's growing. And he's part of that group that's growing it, right? And so these professional middle class artisans and construction workers and architects and bankers and so on really create this Alexandria, and so they put off a certain positioning, but he and his brother quickly connected with the papal delegate for the St. Mark's Cathedral in Alexandria. They took on some construction projects, and they became the Coptic fixers, right? They would be the ones that would build the churches. I don't know how much you know about church building in Egypt at the time, but they really can't build churches because getting licensed to build churches is so difficult.
It's complicated, right?
Very complicated, and oftentimes rejected, right? Certain quotas are put in place. You have to put certain distances between a church and a mosque, for instance. Mosques can get licensed very quickly, and so they would just go up immediately as soon as news of a church was contemplated to be built somewhere, or a Coptic family or the church itself was trying to buy land. And so there were a lot of restrictions legally, but then there were restrictions also in terms of the local community finding out and trying to block it.
Right.
So oftentimes, certain Coptic families, what they would do is they would create a beneficial society and a benevolent society, come together, raise the funds. They would buy an old school, an old home, a plot of land. And as soon as that happens, they would hire contractors in Alexandria. That was my grandfather and his brother, who would come in with workers, lay a wooden structure, an altar, and a priest would be ordained on the altar, pray on it, and it's a fait complet. That's it. Yeah. Once an altar has been prayed on, and this is within the Egyptian legal system at the time. Once an altar has been prayed on, a church is built. You cannot destroy it. You cannot remove it. And so once that initial setup is put in place, it's often done in secret. It's often done kind of off to the side with either bought or borrowed materials. Oftentimes in the 1940s, especially late 1930s, 1940s, they would get materials instead of buying from any outside supplier. They would get from the British forts.
Oh, okay.
Right. So again, there's ways to get around things. And once the church was built and a priest was ordained and people started attending, and it became more obvious, they would then apply for renovation permit, which retroactively licenses the church.
Wow.
And then they would build it up properly. So it was a process. It's kind of like, playing spies a little bit.
Right.
A process to get these churches built. Right. And so during their time, their company is operating basically from the late 1920s until we emigrated. So maybe early 1990s. They built around 34 churches across Alexandria. They built retreat centers for Pope Shenouda all along the North Coast. They had built St. Mina's Monastery. They'd helped to renovate St. Philip Monastery.
In Old Cairo.
Not St. Philip Abu Sufyan.
Abu Sufyan,
the nunnery. The nunnery.
Yes.
Yeah, the convent.
Yeah.
And so they had done all of this work, and I have a memoir of that he wrote of all of this work and the struggles that they found and how they overcame them, and so that became something that really kind of bound me to that history. And then I wanted to understand more. And so my dissertation, which is the book I'm working on, ultimately was supposed to start in 1952 with the Free Officers Revolution in Egypt that overturned British rule, or nominal British rule at the time. And instead, I end up going back to like 1929 and looking at the situation of Copts in Egypt and church reform, church expansion, how the community, the lay community and the Majlis al-Milli, that's the lay council, were operating, right? Because by the 1970s, and I discovered this as well through speaking with family, by the late 1970s, when the Majlis al-Milli was reinstituted, because it's a complicated history, we can get into it later,
Sure.
but the Majlis al-Milli was banned under Gamal Abdel Nasser. It was reinstituted again in 1973 under Sadat. And when it was reinstituted, then my grandfather and his brother became members of the Majlis al-Milli in Alexandria. They were also archdeacons in the church. And so they were heavily involved in that system, as were many of those professionals of standing in the Coptic community in Alexandria, in Cairo, and elsewhere.
And what was the role of the lay council?
So complicated. I would say the role of the lay council when it was reinstituted in the 1970s was much diminished. They were expected at that point just to basically support in raising funds, in connecting people, in voting on key matters as relates to local parishes, but their function had been really stripped by the 1960s, because prior to, so a lot of the big issues in the 40s and 50s around the various popes and the relations with the lay council had to do with debates over al-awqaf, the land endowments, and it was the lay council that controlled land endowments, and the patriarchate wanted control over that because it is an important source of finances. And among other aspects, there was always tensions between
the lay council,
and the patriarchate. And so it is a part of the reason that under Gamal Abdel Nasser, the lay council was disbanded. And so when it was returned in the 1970s, its power, its influence was much reduced.
Very nice. And the memoirs you speak of your grandfather, were they ever published?
No, I just have them in Arabic at home. It's something that I do want to do eventually, is to translate them. I translated parts of them because I wanted to write his story, which I did. I wrote his story for Ruwayat. It's online publication. And it's an incomplete story. I definitely want to revisit it and expand on it. But there is an idea in mind in the future to definitely translate it, yes. But there is a lot on Farag and Sharbim Akladius. There's books and books and books in bookstores in Egypt, in Alexandrian churches, right? Bookstores, they'll have stories about them and their contributions.
They're part of recent history, modern history.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Of the churches.
Exactly.
So how much of the way churches used to be built in Egypt, with the process you described, how much of that would you say is in our collective memories, and how does it affect how we build churches today? Is it still something that's there in the background, kind of guiding decisions, exerting some sort of force, pushing us, open more churches, build more churches? Is it something that we've moved on and just forgotten about?
Certainly not forgotten about. I know that in recent years under President El-Sisi, there has been efforts towards licensing unlicensed churches, speeding up that process, as well as speeding up the process of approvals for church building. Not always successful and not always as fast as people would like it to be for various reasons. But there is surreptitious church building still happening, particularly in remote villages. which ends up resulting in sectarian violence.
Right.
Because news comes out and the local population will respond.
Right.
And so we still, I would say, it's not our past, it's our present in some ways still. And surreptitious church building still continues in some areas. When it comes to El Mahgar, or immigrant lands, I would say that we we are carrying that for sure. You see that amount of churches in the diaspora grows exponentially, and oftentimes. And this is personal observation. Of course, Abuna, I'd love to hear your perspective on it. But I feel like the number of churches far exceeds the population. And I personally miss the good old days of walking into, St. Mark's Church in Scarborough or St. Mary's, or the Virgin Mary's. And it's full.
Right.
It's full to the brim, right? And you're sort of standing in the back, and there are omam, like so many people. And it felt more home. Now I walk into a church and half the pews are empty. And that's because people have a wealth of options,
right?
Which is good. It shows that we're growing, the community's building, and though that investment in more and more churches may be in part motivated by a reaction to that's something that we struggled with for so long there, that now when we come here, we're trying to just keep insisting on our presence by building more and more churches. And we have the capability to do that. So I wonder, it's nothing I've researched intensively, and I feel like that's more in the realm of psychology rather than history, to understand why people do what they do, but it would be fascinating.
Definitely, absolutely, because I don't think that we simply put the past to sleep and we just forgot about it and we moved on. Like we carry that memory, we carry that load with us wherever we go, and it guides our decisions. And speaking of, you did mention you spoke with Father Morcos and you sat down and you spoke about the history. How was it, in early days in the 60s and in the 70s with Father Morcos being, I think he was the only priest in North America. What was that like for him? And how were these first churches coming together?
Oh, that's a big story. So when it comes to the early churches, Father Morcus' story is fascinating. And he has his biography, of course, that he wrote about his experience and the experience of building the early churches. I was fortunate enough to sit with him, not just that one time during my undergrad, but of course when I came to my PhD, I was with him for about 2.5 weeks. I would go visit him on a regular basis to sit down with him. His memory was not as sharp as it once was, and so we would just kind of take our time and look at old photos and spend time listening to stories. And so when I look back on my degree, that's one of my favorite memories. And he's part of a bigger story. Copts in Egypt. So here we can speak to perhaps the 1950s. Are increasingly emigrating and this began, I would say, actually even after the Second World War in the mid 40s, are increasingly emigrating to get their masters or PhDs in Europe. By the 1950s, especially the late 1950s, the US especially is trying to combat communist influences in the Middle East.
Right.
And so they create foreign exchange programs specifically targeting students in Middle East countries who will grow into positions of professional influence. so that they bring them on these Cold War exchange programs to study in America and take on that American perspective or worldview, which is very smart.
Very strategic.
Exactly. And so you have then these students that are going to Western countries. So they're going to England, to France, to Germany. Students coming to the US on J1 visas. These are 5-year visas. And they're coming to study and to learn for their professional advancement in Egypt. Right. The intention was never to emigrate permanently. Right. In the
Just
1950s.
to study and come back.
Study, come back.
Yeah.
One of the key figures that was supporting that movement was Father Makary al-Suryani, who would later become Bishop Samuel. He was the first bishop of public and ecumenical services, and he was reposed to the Lord in 1981, standing alongside Sadat during the assassination. So Father Makary would support their graduate education, writing letters of reference, connecting with colleagues. He was very involved in the ecumenical movement, and so connecting with colleagues in the World Council of Churches, across national councils of churches in various areas, and help them to get those scholarships that would allow them to go and so on. And so slowly these early immigrants start arriving, right? And so when we think of Canada and the US, for instance, you had a handful of graduate students in downtown Toronto, for instance, right? And so these are small groups coming in. Rarely it would be a couple or families. Most often it would be single, students. And then by 1962, by 1959, Gamal Abdel Nasser begins his nationalization project in full force. It's called Egyptianization. By 1962, he begins going further. He begins to nationalize Coptic land, or land belonging to Coptic elite, mainly Coptic Catholic and Coptic Orthodox. But then he also nationalizes the Coptic hospital and slowly Coptic schools as well.
When you say nationalizes,
makes it falls under the state.
Under the state
authority, yeah. And so appointments are under state authority.
Understood, exactly.
And so then Bishop Samuel, he becomes bishop in 1962, right? So it's a fortuitous event.
Yeah.
God's timing. And he reaches out to these students who he had a plan for. Like in his mind, he was always a planner, he was always a calculator. He was the secretary of Pope Kyrillos. Prior to that, he was one of the key figures propelling the Sunday school movement forward. And so he was always a planner. He always had foresight in terms of how do we create space, belonging, presence, visibility for the Copts in Egypt so that we can remain, a necessary presence to protect ourselves despite our minority status. He was very smart.
Yeah.
His whole generation was really. And so he reaches out to these students and he tells them, you know what, like, you shouldn't come back. Right. Several of them that I've spoken with, now retired in California, living life. He just, they had plans to get their medical degrees, for instance, some of them, others engineering degrees or what have you, and return to Egypt and, contribute to the growth of their community and to their own careers and so on. And he just said, don't come back. Right. It didn't make sense at that point. His plans for helping to grow out the community and our presence and our stature and our belonging in Egypt. And so in his mind and even in their minds as well, they would be of better service to themselves and their families and their future and their prosperity living abroad, but also of better service to the church and to the community living abroad. Because those early immigrants had become increasingly involved in various ecumenical works. So this is ecumenism, for anyone who doesn't know, is about creating stronger bonds between the various denominations and finding a unity of purpose. And so there is that ideal of doctrinal unity, but that's still remains an ideal out of reach. However, a unity of purpose in social services, in social activism, in growing the interconnectedness of the various denominations towards building that universal church and that universal presence, is part of the ecumenical mission. And so they were becoming increasingly involved in that work and able to raise funds and to support people at home and so on. And so that early presence in Toronto, by the early 1960s, is a handful of families. By my count, it was no more than maybe 30 individuals and families. And the community in New York, for instance, like the New York, New Jersey area, was much larger, right? Over 100, maybe 120. Wow. So it's much larger. But it's mainly graduate students, young single working people, small families scattered here and there. And that group in New York and New Jersey begins the Coptic Association of... No, sorry, the Coptic American Association, the CAA.
The CAA.
Yeah. So that Coptic American Association then petitions for a priest to come meet their needs. And I don't know if you're aware, I'm sure you've read his book. Father Marcos was doing a graduate degree in the US for a time. And then he went back to teach at the clerical college in Cairo. And so they knew him. And he prayed with them. And so they requested Wagdi Elias Abdel Masih, who would become Father Marcos. But then he didn't want to go. He didn't want the ordination. He struggled with that, taking on that role. And so there are fun little stories about like the things he did to try to get out of it. And but then he, Pope Kyrillos was like, "You're going." So it was really fun hearing him tell me the story. Like, these memories that kind of just stick with you. And he was supposed to go to New York, and they expected him to go to New York, and they paid for him to go to New York. However, he couldn't get a visa to the US. He had to have served for 2 years as a priest. He had to have traveled to oversee this community prior to that. Like, there were restrictions.
So it just wasn't possible for him.
Exactly. And so he goes to Canada, and he goes by way of Italy. He attends Vatican II. This is around 1963, 1964. And you can learn a lot more about his misadventures in Vatican in his book, plugging it in. And he comes to Toronto, and fortuitously he comes to Toronto because there's young families. There was a couple of marriages in Anglican churches before he arrived. So he comes in, he brings people together. You have this kind of community begin to build. He and his wife, he and Tassoni, Susan, are kind of nomads a little bit, sleeping on people's couches, going to people's homes until they get the place.
A residence place.
Exactly. Which is a story I'm sure Abuna is not new. We hear it often to this day. And he's getting direct instruction from Bishop Samuel. So I found letters upon letters of instruction. Like, do this, create this, these 5 steps are what is needed next. The one who took the action, the one who performed the work, of course, is Father Marcos, and it's a monumental work to be the only priest in North America. Of course. But he was under the supervision of Bishop Samuel, which is a story that I'd never heard growing up. And so it's something that I discovered through my research. Because Bishop Samuel, from the moment he's ordained in 1962, of course, prior to that, as Father McCary, he was overseeing the diaspora regardless. But officially, as of 1962, when he's ordained a general bishop, the supervision of the diaspora is given to him by Pope Kyrillos. And he holds that until 1972, when after Pope Shenouda is enthroned, he takes that supervision. And so for those 10 years, anything that's happening, churches getting built, priests getting ordained, communities raising funds, coming together, so on, Bishop Samuel is directly involved in that work. And the relationship between Toronto and New York is quite complex in this early period because the association in New York was still funding Father Marcos, even though he was living in Toronto, and they were quite upset by it. And they managed to connect with government, get him a visa to come live in the US. He refused, and he refused for a reason, because when he looked at the population, and this was also a conversation that he had with Bishop Samuel directly, when he looked at the population of young families with babies in Toronto, and it was growing at quite a rapid pace, because in the 1960s, at that time, Canada was more attractive than the US for Egyptian Copts. And it had a reason to do with Canada's own geopolitical positioning in the Middle East that we can get to at another time. There's a lot of threads that I've pulled over the years. Whereas in New York, it was a lot of graduate students. And so he felt that, like, a lot of graduate students, more wealthy families, and they had that network, they had that association, and they would meet every month for Bible study. And so, like, they had that kind of nashat. And so he felt like he and Bishop Samuel felt that it's better to stay in Toronto.
Canada, in Toronto.
And so the CAA stopped funding Father Marcos. And so the community in Toronto really had to come together, and it was a bit of a struggle. But they managed to rent at Holy Trinity. I don't know if you know Holy Trinity in downtown Toronto. So the upstairs attic of Holy Trinity, the chapel, which was used recently by SMSK, I believe, before they got their own building.
That's right.
And so there's
an article about it in a newspaper long ago, but Copts in the attic.
Copts in the attic. I love that. I always show it wherever I talk. I always found it really, wonderful. And I'd always wonder how many people who were worshiping at Holy Trinity, part of the SMSK parish, how many of them know that they're standing where 60 years prior, those first group of Copts were standing and worshiping with Father Marcos. So there is that kind of cyclical nature to life, I guess. And slowly it grew. So Father Marcos, followed by Father Rafael Nakhla for Montreal, again, a priest for Canada. So of course the Americans were not particularly happy.
2-0 for Canada. I'm not happy about that.
But of course, Father Rafael, for a purpose, right? He studied at the Sorbonne, right? He was fluent in French. And so they bring him to cater to that French Canadian milieu, right? And those two priests, Father Marcos and Father Rafael, begin to kind of create the foundational structure of the church as we know it today, right? The Diocese of North America, the church board rules and regulations, the bylaws of the church, all of that material. And I have access to all of that material from the 1960s. And so they are creating that structure of like, how do we deal with issues? What is the role of the church? What is the role of the priest? What is the role of the lay, the church board, the parishioners? And there was a lot of tension in those early years around control.
Right. Trying to figure out where all the pieces go, right?
And especially because they're operating between two systems. You have in the US, sorry, not in the US, in Egypt, we have a very hierarchical structure, right? But in North America, you have a congregational structure.
Right.
So a congregational structure means that the congregation gets to tell the priest where they want things to go.
Right.
right? Where do we want money invested into? How are we going to move forward and build? It's a conversation. There's a lot more power invested in the congregation. In our hierarchical structure in Egypt, there's a lot more power invested in the priest and in the church hierarchy to determine what is the best direction for the church and community. And so that created a lot of debate.
I can
and
imagine.
tension.
Yeah.
And especially because, and it's wonderful to see, our early bylaws, our early templates and structures were essentially drawing on Protestant church bylaws, right? Because, of course, as you know, a new immigrant comes in, even someone like Father Marcos, a new immigrant comes in and starts kind of wanting to create structure and paperwork and register everything and so on. So who are they going to turn to? They're going to turn to other religious leaders
Neighboring
that they are
churches to see,
encountering,
of course,
and get their, templates and use them as a building block for their own. And so that even in the bylaws, there is some, tension as to who has authority.
right?
But yeah, so that's early institutional building. By the mid 1960s, around 1967, I would say, around the around the 6 Day War, the population is growing. You have maybe about 500 families across the various parishes. So here I'm thinking Montreal, Toronto, New York. These are like the three hotspots.
Yeah.
And it's slowly growing, and Father Robert El Amin comes to New Jersey, the first American priest, finally. And it continues to grow. Father Tedros Malati is brought in after Father Bishoy Kamel. So Father Bishoy Kamel kind of institutes the early kind of financial picture of a church in California. Father Tedros Malati follows to help in the purchase of the church, in the establishment of a community, in leading them.
And that was in the late 60s as well.
So Father Robert Amin is around 1971. And then immediately after, you begin to see Father Bishoy Kamel come visit, help to set up an association, raise the funds, all of that. There's a wonderful story that Tassoni and Jill shared with me when I spent time with her. About how the money purse got lost, and then the taxi driver came and dropped it off at their home, and it was just like it was just these events that sort of happened to Father Bishoy Kamel throughout his life, and then Father Tedros Malati comes in. There's a reason for why it was Father Bishoy Kamel and Father Tedros Malati, but we don't have to get into that.
Yeah. Wow, that's knowing how all of this started, all of this began, gives you kind of like this perspective about where the hand of God was guiding the church and leading the church, and it starts unintentional with all of these immigrants going for study purposes, temporary, and then they end up staying and creating communities and creating lives that no one planned on, and we kind of encounter the role of or the character of Bishop Samuel. And to be honest, we know very little about him, generally speaking. Personally, for the longest time, all I knew about him was that he was there at the assassination of Sadat, and he was assassinated as well. And that was it. That's basically the one, tidbit I knew about him. And as for his role in the lands of immigration and how it got started, really, like, this was all new to me when we started having these conversations. And it wasn't just with the immigration, but he has a role with ecumenism, right? How did this start? Was it something that was the whole church was starting to focus on, or is it just Bishop Samuel who just had this personal interest in talking with other groups and making connections with that group? Like, how did it get started?
So again, very big questions, Abuna. I would say that if we want to understand that kind of impulse in the church, he definitely wasn't the only one.
It wasn't.
He
Okay.
wasn't. But it was a minority that was pushing for that. So it was not mainstreamed in the church at the time as much as it is now. Now it's at the heart of the church, and it has a lot to do, of course, with that key group that were church servants, became monks, became bishops, became, you know, Pope Shenouda,
Of course.
Bishop Samuel, Bishop Gregorios, Abuna Metta al-Miskin, and so on and so on. Like that community of intellectuals and activists that really flourished and came out of a particular moment in Egyptian history in the 1930s. And it's something that I always try to do in my work, is to contextualize them within the broader kind of changes in Egypt, not just in the church, because they are Egyptian and not just isolated within the church. And so I would say to understand what happened, I would want to go back to, let's say, the 1930s. And there is Harkat Madaris al-Ahad, that is the church, the Sunday school movement. And the movement begins in the 1890s, really, under Habib Girgis. And he begins to train young people, give them religious instruction, grows out this early group. And by the 1910s, you have what was it called? The something brotherly love. It's a group that comes together in around 1910 to create that early infrastructure of publishing and reaching out, and of course you have the building of the clerical college. You have the early attempts, and then eventually the establishment of the Coptic Museum and that institutional structure of Coptic education and revival. Il-Nahda, this renaissance in the Coptic Church, really takes shape between the 1890s and 1920s. And then by the 1930s, you have this young group of activists, Copts. Among them is Saad Aziz, who becomes Bishop Samuel, Yassa Hanna, and who would become, and those who would become Bishop Gregorios and Abuna Metta, and of course Nazir Gaid, who would become Pope Shenouda. I can't remember all of their lay names, so I try to mix and match. I hope it's clear. And so they begin gathering in Giza and Shobra. I mean, they start in El-Fagala. That's where the Sunday school movement begins. El-Fagala is in the middle between Giza and Shobra, just for those who don't know Egyptian geography. And so they start in Al-Fagala, right? The Sunday school movement. However, Saad Aziz, who is in Giza, wants to cater to those Copts that are coming from universities or coming to university in Cairo from Upper Egypt.
Right.
And Nazir Gaid is in Shobra. And he's more catering to those Shobra Copts, Caireans. And so the demographics are a little bit different. And so the interests are a little bit different. And so there's a very popular story that I've heard often, and I've ended up telling in my own work, of how a young group of Copts in the 1930s, among them, of course, Saad Aziz and his compatriots, are sitting in church on a Thursday. They negotiated with the priest to be able to use the church for Bible study. they're the ones paying for the gas to be able to light up and heat the church so they can use it. Because of course, you know, the biggest opposition to holding any services outside of the Sunday liturgy at the time was to how do we pay for it, right? And who's going to oversee it? And priests at the time were very hesitant to do anything other than the liturgy.
Than the Sunday liturgy.
Exactly. And so this group had negotiated, had figured it out, had raised some funds to be able to hold their, you know, once a week Bible study. So there's this really famous story of a friend of theirs, you know, someone they knew, barging in and telling them, how dare you eat of all of this bread when your brothers and sisters are do not have a crumb, right? And I'm translating here. Yeah. It sounds more lyrical in the Arabic.
In Arabic, of course.
And so what he was intending, of course, is to say, you know, here you are eating of the bread of life, you know, speaking of God, learning of your faith, when those in Upper Egypt, you know, your brothers and sisters can't even have a crumb of that, right? Because there's often in those Upper Egyptian villages, like outside of the metropole, outside of, you know, the big cities, you really had illiterate priests who inherited the position from their father and grandfather and so on. You had few churches, if any, in some villages, and no kind of education in terms of educating the younger generations about who they are as Copts.
Not much in terms of religious education.
Exactly. Yeah. And so not much in terms of education more generally, but yes, religious education. Yeah. And so you have conversion to Islam running rampant. More of a threat at the time was conversion by Protestant and Anglican missionaries.
That's right.
Right, so Presbyterian and Anglican missionaries who initially come in the 1870s or so, looking to convert the heathen Muslim to Christianity, are very unsuccessful. Right. So then they target the heathen Copts to convert them to true Christianity, right? Yeah. And so increasingly you have Copts for one reason or another, whether it's for financial expediency by the landed elite, those with land with access to money might convert out of Orthodoxy to, for instance, Anglicanism, for the purpose of creating networks and connections and being able to grow in their financial position. Right. But of course, at the time, I mean, they're not very well connected or feel a bond to what it means to be Coptic Orthodox anyways, right? And then, of course, you have the average peasants who are, in essence, then being drawn into, because of the ignorance of what it is to be Coptic Orthodox, being drawn towards some converting to Islam for expediency, for, you know, upward mobility, for access, for fear. Right.
There's a variety of reasons.
Exactly. And then others being drawn into missionary schools. And then these missionary schools are influencing certain sets of ideas, of beliefs. And so then they are converting out of Coptic Orthodoxy and into, you know, Presbyterian or Anglican faiths, which today we know as, you know, we have in Egypt, you know, Coptic Orthodox, but we also have Coptic Catholics, we have Coptic Anglican, Coptic Protestant. And so these Coptic denominations in Egypt, they have the moniker Coptic because they are of an Egyptian flavor, right? But they still look elsewhere than to the Pope of Alexandria for authority. And so coming back to the story then of this young man, he tells them of what he saw. Yeah. Right? This conversion out, this influence, this, we don't have any kind of anything
Right.
for our community. And so they quickly jump to engagement, right? And so then they're learning, and they begin to gather young people, young university students, several of whom I've spoken with, who would come together and learn for a couple of weeks under the direction of these Sunday school leaders.
Yeah.
And then they would go 2 by 2 every Thursday, returning Saturday night, right, the weekend in
The
Egypt.
weekend, basically.
Yeah, they would go and they would ride a train, go to villages, all the way to, like, you know, Luxor and Aswan, right? Like they would just kind of take the train, right, go to villages. They each had their own route, their own, you know, structured places to be. And they would perform a service. They would
When you
gather
say service, like a meeting,
like a meeting, yeah, a meeting, and lead people in prayer, and then they would gather the young people together. And so I have these lovely photos, you know, black and white photos from the 1940s of young servants standing with like all of these kids surrounding them, looking up at them as they're talking. And it's lovely. It's that was the early beginning, right? And when Saad Aziz is kind of leading all of this work, right? It's very, how do I put this? Socially oriented.
Right.
It's about the state of society.
Yeah.
Nazir Gaid and the Shobra faction, as they're popularly known, wanted to be more spiritually oriented. And so they felt that that was lacking in Giza. That you were kind of having these training sessions, going out and telling people about their faith, but you were not, you know, immersing yourselves in the study of the faith to the point that you should be doing this. Like, we should wait. We should hold off, basically.
Yeah.
And so there was these constant debates, and they would get into fights at the Sunday school, like gatherings, the annual gatherings, and shouting matches and so on as to like what should be the direction the church goes into.
So there used to be annual conferences where all these Sunday school leaders would gather.
Yeah. And so what Saad Aziz ends up doing then is pushing for, I mean, him and his colleagues, again, I don't like to give credit to any single person. I feel like this is all happening in conversation, right? And there is key leaders that are involved with vision, but then there are others who are collaborating and supporting that growth. And they begin to publish little pamphlets in I forget the name. The Sunday school had its own kind of publishing house.
I see.
I forget the name. And so they begin to publish these little pamphlets, and then they'd spread them out in the villages to give some instruction as to what your faith is, what we believe. And Saad Aziz, then him and his colleagues begin to see that they're getting a lot of pushback from the church hierarchy as to the work that they're doing on the ground. And there's decisions to take monastic orders. But they're also getting pushback about taking monastic orders. Because there is a fear of this young generation coming into the church and making too many changes too fast.
Yeah.
So they weren't particularly liked by the old guard. So what ends up happening is they connect with Abuna Min al-Matawahid fi Tahuna in Pope Carlos. And they go and they connect with him, and they build a little kind of teaching house right next to the windmill, so that he can like instruct them, and they can continue to kind of stay near him and live there and learn from him. And as soon as the opportunity arises, they ask him to nominate them to be ordained as monks. By they, here the first two, the first one is Father Makary, Saad Aziz.
Yeah.
He's joined by Abu Namata, right? Father Makary, just to kind of give you a sense of how pioneering he is, he was the first university educated monk to be ordained. And so it took be consecrated, sorry. So just imagine that. But prior to him, the monastic profession was seen as, or not profession, but monasticism was seen as the purview of the poor and
the illiterate,
illiterate criminals who would, go take monastic orders to escape the state. So it wasn't particularly seen as like something you go into with a well-educated, good family.
Like if you have options, why would you choose
exactly
that? Right.
And so his family was actually against it early on. So he gets ordained along with Father Metta to the monastery that was kind of derelict, falling apart, given to Abu Namina to oversee it for a time.
Yeah.
That was Deir Samwili, St. Samuel Monastery. So it had been abandoned. It was derelict. It was given, oversight of it was kind of given to Abu Namina. So what he does is he sends them there to kind of bring it back. And he consecrates them as Father Makary el-Samwili and Father Matta el-Samwili.
Right.
Right. So you have both el-Samwili. And I actually, I have this letter of, Father Makary el-Samwili. Like it's actually written el-Samwili, which was the first time I'd ever seen it in my life. And they go.
Yeah.
But then bishops find out.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. For questions, comments, feedback, or if you'd like to make a suggestion on a topic for a future episode, please feel free to reach out to the email in the bio. And don't forget to subscribe to get a notification when new episodes drop. God bless you and have a great day.